All right, let's talk about a man who didn't just play the game on Wall Street, he completely rigged it. He became the living, breathing symbol of 1980s excess and, really, a cautionary tale for the ages. This is the incredible story of Ivan Boesky.
$100 million. Let that number sink in for a second. Back in 1986, this wasn't just a fine, it was a message. This was the record-shattering penalty Ivan Boesky had to pay for his crimes. A number so big, it sent a tidal wave of shock through the entire financial world, pretty much signaling that the wild, freewheeling party of the 80s was coming to an end.
You know, that quote wasn't some exaggeration from a rival. It was from an attorney for another executive that Boesky implicated. It just perfectly captures how formidable and, frankly, how feared he was. A guy with immense power whose spectacular rise was matched only by the absolute drama of his downfall.
So, how in the world did a man from a pretty humble background climb to the absolute peak of the financial world, only to fall so far? Well, to really understand the man, we've got to go back to the beginning.
The speed of his ascent was just staggering. I mean, born to a deli owner in Detroit, he starts his own firm in 1975 with some family money. A little over a decade later, he's a complete Wall Street legend, the undisputed king of arbitrage, with a personal fortune of over $200 million. And then, in May of '86, right at the absolute height of his power, he gives a speech that would basically define an entire era. Standing in front of a class of graduates, Boesky just comes out and says it. I think greed is healthy. Just 1 year later, that exact sentiment was immortalized by Gordon Gekko in the movie Wall Street. Boesky wasn't just some trader. He was the actual real-life inspiration for one of cinema's most iconic villains. He was the living embodiment of that greed is good ethos.
But you know, behind all that fame and all that fortune was a massive criminal conspiracy. So the question is, how did he really make his money? Let me tell you, it wasn't just skill. It was a well-oiled illegal machine. Now, on paper, his job was something called risk arbitrage. It's a legitimate, though pretty risky strategy where you bet on corporate takeovers. You buy stock in a company you think is about to be acquired, and if the deal happens, the stock price usually jumps and boom, you make a profit. But here's the catch. Boesky wasn't just believing or guessing, he knew. The scheme itself was actually pretty simple, really, just 5 steps. First, you have insiders like the investment banker Dennis Levine who learn about these top-secret takeovers. Second, they illegally leak that info to Boesky. Third, Boesky goes and buys up huge amounts of that company's stock. Fourth, when the news finally goes public, the stock soars, and Boesky sells for an insane profit. And finally, step 5, the informants get paid their cut, sometimes literally in briefcases stuffed with cash.
Now, what we're talking about here, in its purest form, is the very definition of insider trading. It's using confidential, important information that the public has no access to get a totally unfair advantage. It just fundamentally breaks the whole principle of a level playing field that our financial markets are supposed to be built on.
And of course, they went to incredible lengths to hide all of this. This wasn't some simple handshake deal. The whole scheme relied on this complex web of phony corporations set up in places like Panama, with money flowing through offshore bank accounts in the Bahamas. See, these countries had really strict bank secrecy laws, which made it incredibly hard for U.S. investigators to even begin to follow the money trail.
But no matter how complex your scheme is, secrets rarely stay buried forever. And when this one started to unravel, it created a domino effect that would end up toppling some of the absolute biggest names on Wall Street.
The beginning of the end wasn't even Boesky himself. It was one of his key informants, Dennis Levine. When investigators finally cornered Levine in May of '86, he was looking at a long prison sentence. So, to save his own skin, he started talking. And the biggest name he gave up? Ivan Boesky.
And, wouldn't you know it, faced with the same mountain of evidence and the thought of decades behind bars, Boesky did the exact same thing Levine did. The king of arbitrage, the titan of Wall Street, he cut a deal with the government and became an informant himself.
And the target Boesky delivered to the feds was an even bigger fish. A man who had totally revolutionized finance in the 1980s and was, arguably, the single most powerful figure on all of Wall Street, the so-called junk bond king, Michael Milken.
Okay, and this is where the story just turns into a Hollywood thriller. Boesky, now working for the U.S. attorney at the time, a guy named Rudolph Giuliani, literally agreed to wear a wire. He secretly recorded his conversations with his former partner in crime, Michael Milken, gathering all the evidence the government needed to build its case.
The fallout was just immense. Boesky pled guilty, paid that historic $100 million fine, and served 20 months in prison. Michael Milken also pled guilty and served 22 months. And the powerful investment bank right at the center of the whole thing, Drexel Burnham Lambert, was forced into bankruptcy. This scandal didn't just take down individuals, it completely destroyed one of the most dominant firms on Wall Street.
The Boesky scandal, though, was way more than just a story of individual greed. Its shockwaves forced a fundamental reckoning in Washington and permanently changed the rules of the game. The sheer scale and just the audacity of these crimes created what lawmakers at the time called an irresistible momentum for reform. There was no question about it. The scandal was a direct catalyst for change. It forced Congress to act. The result was the Insider Trading and Securities Fraud Enforcement Act of 1988. This was a landmark law. It dramatically jacked up the penalties for the crime, making the risks way higher. But crucially, it put the responsibility on the firms themselves to police their own people, holding them accountable and requiring them to build what are called Chinese walls to stop sensitive information from leaking. And, in a really ironic twist, it created financial bounties for whistleblowers, turning the very act of informing, the thing that brought Boesky down, into official government policy.
So, in the end, Ivan Boesky's legacy is, well, it's a complicated one. His crimes definitely led to stronger laws and a whole new era of enforcement that reshaped the financial industry, but it leaves us with this big lingering question. While the rules might have changed, has that underlying culture, the one that celebrated Boesky's mantra of greed is healthy, really disappeared? That's something worth thinking about.